Howdy again everyone, my name's Chris and today I'm happy to be testing out the new Sigma 14-24mm f2.8 DG-DN-A for art lens. It's a full-frame ultra-wide-angle zoom lens which is currently just for Sony's mirrorless E-mount cameras and for L-mount cameras too, although I'd be surprised if it doesn't eventually make it onto Canon and Nikon's new full-frame mirrorless systems too. I'd like to thank Sigma UK for loaning me a copy of this lens for a week or so, but as usual, this is a totally independent review. Its cost is $1,400 in the US, or about £1,400 in the UK, so it'd better be good. As I mentioned, this is the DG-DN-A for art lens. Don't mix it up with Sigma's very similar DG-HSM version of the lens, which is physically much bigger and designed for digital SLR cameras. It's easier to design wide-angle lenses on mirrorless cameras, and so this specialized DG-DN mirrorless version has different optics inside, and is much smaller and lighter than its counterpart for digital SLR cameras. I really love its relatively compact size, actually. But what's most exciting of course is that spectacular zoom range on a full-frame camera, which goes from a very wide angle of 24mm and zooms out to a gapingly wide 14mm. Combined with that bright maximum aperture of f2.8, this lens is open to all kinds of different and exciting uses: landscape photography, indoors pictures, even astrophotography. It's really versatile and will pair up very nicely with a standard zoom lens. On an APS-C camera, that zoom range is the full-frame equivalent of a much less thrilling 21-36mm. Still useful, but really, this lens is properly intended for full-frame shooters. Let's take a closer look, firstly at the build quality. I love the way this lens looks and handles. It's a lovely size and weight, tipping the scales at about 800 grams. The lens's body is a mixture of metal and plastic, feeling nice and solid. It's all based on a metal lens mount with a weather sealing gasket and an integrated holder for rear gel filters. Next comes the rubberized zoom ring, which turns perfectly smoothly with no stickiness or unevenness to it of any kind. Then the focus ring, again rubberized and turning amazingly smoothly, and the lens's focus motor responds very well as you use it. The lens's autofocus motor is nice and accurate, quiet and averagely fast, as you can see here. The lens has a built-in hood which you cannot remove, and unfortunately you can't use conventional filters with the lens, but it does come with a nice cap which fits on perfectly, as well as one of Sigma's lens bags. It does not have image stabilization. Overall, perfect professional build quality here for an optic of this type. As I mentioned, the only little niggle is that front filters cannot be used. Alright, what's more important is, of course, image quality. Let's mount it onto my full-frame camera first, a 42-megapixel Sony a7R II. In the middle of the image at 14mm, straight from f2.8, image quality is ridiculously sharp, with excellent contrast. And the corners? Well, outstanding. This is incredibly impressive. To really appreciate what we're dealing with here, by way of comparison, here's the closest equivalent lens that I've tested to the Sigma, the Sony Zeiss 16-35mm f4. The Sigma lens, despite being a stop brighter, makes a complete mockery of the older Sony optic. Anyway, at 14mm, the Sigma lens remains this sharp even if you stop down to f11 or so, although if you stop down too much, say to f22, then diffraction kicks in, leading to a softer image. Well, let's zoom in to 24mm now. Happily, it's a similar story. The lens remains incredibly sharp in the middle, straight from f2.8, and the corners of your images see only the slightest little reduction in sharpness. Stop down to f5.6 or f8 for minuscule improvements there. Overall though, it's a jaw-droppingly sharp performance on full frame throughout the entire zoom and aperture range. Alright, as I mentioned before, it's really a lens for full frame cameras, But let's give it a quick try on my Sony a5100 with its 24 megapixel APS-C sensor. In the middle of the image at 14mm, we see ridiculous sharpness again at f2.8. The corners are softer now though. They improve at f4, and at f5.6 they match the perfection of the middle. They stay this sharp down to about f16. Let's zoom in to 24mm now, and it's the same story. At f2.8, perfection in the middle, but a little softer in the corners. Stop down to f4 for an improvement, f5.6 for excellent. So, if you really must use this lens on an APS-C camera, you'll find a generally great performance, but the corners benefit from stopping down. Such are the unpredictable demands of APS-C. Now, let's look at distortion and vignetting on a full-frame camera. Your camera will automatically correct these for you, but you can turn those corrections off to see the true picture. At 14mm, we see considerable barrel distortion and heavy vignetting at f2.8. Stop down to f4, f5.6 and f8 for gradual improvements. Zoom in to 20mm to see that distortion straighten out, and at 24mm we get slight pincushion distortion and noticeable vignetting, although it's much less than it was at 14mm. Just stop down to f4 now to brighten those corners. Overall, you might as well leave your in-camera corrections turned on here, although if you're doing astrophotography or something else where barrel distortion isn't really a problem for you, then you could leave distortion correction off to get maybe a tiny bit of extra detail in the corners of your final images. Next, close-up image quality. This lens can focus as closely as 28cm, not bad for smaller subjects. At f2.8, close-up image quality is sharp, but also really hazy. Stop down to f4 though, and contrast makes a triumphant comeback for you. Now, let's see how the lens works against bright lights. We can spot a number of flecks of flaring dancing about there, but contrast remains strong, so it's a fairly good performance overall. And while we're shooting in the dark, let's look at chroma levels. Due to heavy cloud cover, astrophotography wasn't really an option for me this time, but you can see some bright points of light in the corners of this image here, and thankfully we don't really see much smearing. Chroma is nicely under control, so this could of course be a great lens for astrophotography. And finally, bokeh. If you zoom in a bit and get close to your subject, then at f2.8, dramatically wide and out of focus backgrounds are your reward. Thankfully, they always look reasonably smooth, which is not always guaranteed on wide-angle zoom lenses. Overall, well, I absolutely loved this camera lens and using it was a great joy. In all areas of its performance, it deeply impresses, from its versatility, its relatively compact size, its nice build quality, and crucially, its incredibly sharp optical performance, which is so important in such a wide-angle lens. To my mind, the one and only fly in the ointment here is that you can't use conventional filters with it. A real shame, although there are less conventional options out there. For example, I know that Haida are launching an adapter to let you use their M15 filter system with this lens. But really, it's easily the sharpest ultra-wide angle zoom lens I've ever tested, and one of the most enjoyable and useful too. It was on loan to me for a couple of weeks. Unfortunately, I had to give it back. It's my favourite ultra-wide angle lens I've ever tested, and I can't recommend it enough.